Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're shrinking down, way down, to explore something most of us probably don't think about too much: sodium and potassium ions.
Tiny but mighty, right.
Exactly. And to guide us on this deep dive, we've got this really cool article from Assay Genie. It's a science resource website. It's all about how scientists actually study these tiny elements. I mean, the article even points out that they're involved in pretty much everything our bodies do, from how our brains work to, get this, our hearts beating.
It's true. Sodium and potassium ions, or NiO and Ki, if you want to get technical, they really are essential for, well, life as we know it.
Okay, so back in high school chemistry class, I vaguely remember those symbols from the periodic table, but honestly, what are they actually doing in our bodies?
So think about this. Action potentials. You know those electrical signals that zip along our nerves? Well, it's sodium and potassium ions moving across cell membranes that are actually creating those signals.
Right, so those tiny things are responsible for our brains sending messages.
Exactly. But it's even more than that. Fluid balance, how our bodies maintain the right amount of fluids, that relies on these ions too. And enzyme activation, those little helpers that speed up chemical reactions. Yep, they need sodium and potassium too.
Wow. Okay, so our bodies would literally just stop working without them.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it's not just the big things. Even those tiny channels that control what goes in and out of our cells, they rely on these ions too. It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
It is. But like, how do scientists even study something that small? Can you even see an ion under a microscope?
You can't just see them directly. They're way too small for that.
So how do they do it?
That's where the ingenuity of science comes in. Scientists have developed some amazing tools to study these tiny particles. One of the coolest are things called indicators. These are molecules that change their properties when they bind to specific ions.
So it's like they attach a little flag to the ion so they can track it?
Exactly. It's like trying to follow a tiny invisible speck. The indicator attaches to it, and boom, suddenly we can see it.
That's pretty clever. So what kind of change happens? Do they like change color or something when they bind to the ion?
Some do.
Oh,
But there are these even cooler indicators called fluorescent indicators.
fluorescent, like glow in the dark.
Exactly. Imagine you're looking at a cell under a microscope, and all of a sudden, a specific spot lights up. That's a sodium or potassium ion binding to its fluorescent indicator.
Okay, yeah, that is pretty cool. It's like the ions are sending up a signal flare. Hey, look at me. So what are some of these indicators that scientists use? I mean, do they have names?
Oh yeah, they have names. For sodium, there's sodium green, which is pretty straightforward.
Makes sense.
And then there's SBFI. And for potassium, PBFI is a popular one. And they each have, their own specific properties that make them good for studying different things, like how sodium levels change during those nerve impulses we were talking about.
So using these indicators, scientists can actually watch these tiny ions move around in a living cell. That's kind of like science fiction. But hold on, this article also mentions something called biosensors. Are those like indicators too?
They are, but think of them as even more advanced. Instead of adding a separate indicator, imagine you could engineer a cell to make its own, internal ion detector.
Whoa, so it's like the cell is spying on its own ions? That's wild.
Yeah, these genetically encoded biosensors are super powerful. They can give us incredibly detailed information about what the ions are doing in real time.
That's insane. It's like having a tiny microscope inside the cell itself. Okay, so we've got indicators that make ions visible, and we've got these super spy biosensors. This is already blowing my mind. But wait, the article mentions one more thing. Ionophores. What are those all about? Are they like tools to study ions too?
They are. But while indicators and biosensors help us observe ions, ionophores allow us to actually manipulate them.
Wait, manipulate them. You mean like actually change how many ions are in a cell?
Exactly. Think of them as the gatekeepers of the cell membrane. They can control which ions are allowed in or out.
That's incredible. Why would scientists want to change the number of ions inside a cell, though?
It's all about understanding cause and effect. By changing the concentration of sodium or potassium, we can see how a cell responds. Does its activity change? What other processes are affected? It helps us piece together how these tiny ions affect the bigger picture of how our bodies work.
So it's like a controlled experiment. Tweak the ion levels and see what happens. But how do these ionophores actually work? Are there like different kinds?
There are. The article mentions two main types: carrier ionophores and channel ionophores.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Carrier ionophores, you can think of them like tiny taxis. They bind to a specific ion and carry it across the cell membrane.
So they're picky. They only take certain passengers.
Exactly. It's like a taxi service that only goes to one specific destination. And then there are channel ionophores. They're more like tunnels or pores through the membrane. They create a pathway for ions to flow through.
So carrier ionophores are like private cars, and channel ionophores are more like a public transportation system for ions.
I like that analogy. And, the article even gives some specific
Oh,
examples.
yeah.
Yeah, like valinomycin, that's a carrier ionophore that loves potassium. But monensin, that one prefers sodium. And for a channel ionophore, there's gramacydin. That one creates a little pore for certain types of ions to pass through.
So why is it so important for scientists to be able to change those ion concentrations? What can we learn from that?
Well, think about it. If you can tweak the levels of, say, sodium or potassium in a controlled way, you can start to understand how those changes affect a cell or even a whole organism.
Okay, I'm starting to see how it all fits together now. We've got these tiny but super important ions, and scientists have developed all these amazing tools to study them. But what does all this mean for us in the real world? Why should we care about what these tiny ions are up to?
That's where it gets really interesting. Understanding how these ions work at such a fundamental level could have huge implications for things like medicine, developing new drugs, and just generally understanding how our bodies work.
So, like, how does this science actually translate into something that could help us in our everyday lives?
Well, remember how we talked about sodium and potassium playing a role in how our hearts beat and how our nerves send signals? By really understanding how those processes work at a molecular level, scientists could potentially develop drugs that target very specific parts of those processes, like maybe a drug that could fix an imbalance of ions that leads to a heart problem.
So, it's like we're learning to speak the language of our cells and figure out how to tell them what to do. That's incredible, but it sounds like the research could go even further than that.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about understanding how our bodies work in general. How do our cells communicate with each other? How do our organs work together to keep us alive? How do we maintain balance in all the systems of our bodies?
Wow, that's a lot to think about. Wow, that's a lot to think about. Before the break, we were talking about how understanding these tiny ions could actually lead to new ways to treat diseases. Is there anything else you can tell us about what the future holds for this kind of research?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the research is constantly moving forward. Scientists are always trying to develop new and better tools.
So what are some of the things they're working on?
Well, for one thing, they're trying to make indicators and ionophores even more, well, sensitive.
Sensitive.
Yeah. Like, imagine an indicator that could detect even the tiniest changes in ion concentration, or an ionophore that could target a very specific type of cell.
That would be incredible. Like having a super-powered microscope for the world of ions.
Yeah.
What kind of impact could those advancements have? Like if we could zoom in that closely, what would we learn?
Oh, man, the possibilities are so exciting. Imagine being able to, like, watch brain activity in real time, actually seeing those ion fluxes as thoughts form, or delivering drugs to only the cells that need them. No more side effects, just pure effectiveness.
So we're basically refining our ability to see and manipulate these ions, and that's opening up new ways to understand and treat diseases.
Exactly. And it's happening on a few different fronts, too. Not only are scientists developing better tools, but they're also combining them with some really cutting-edge technologies like imaging and computational modeling.
Computational modeling. Wait, how does that fit in with studying something as small as an ion?
It's all about putting the pieces together, right? We can use computer models to simulate how ions move and interact within cells and tissues. It's like a virtual laboratory. We can test things out, make predictions about how changing things might affect everything.
So instead of just observing cells directly, you can create a simulation and see what happens when you, say, change the ion concentration.
That's the idea. And these models are getting more and more sophisticated all the time. We can really study complex systems and get a much deeper understanding of how it all works together.
Man, this deep dive is really making me realize just how much is going on at a level we can't even see. We've gone from simple magnifying glasses to virtual laboratories. It's amazing how far science has come.
Yeah, it really is. And it's all thanks to the dedication of so many researchers working tirelessly to understand the world around us, even at the tiniest levels.
It's pretty inspiring, and this article from Assay Genie has been a fantastic guide for us today. But I mean, even with all this incredible research, there's still so much we don't know, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're just scratching the surface when it comes to sodium and potassium ions and how they impact life as we know it. We've talked about nerves, muscles, fluid balance. But what other secrets could they be hiding?
That's a great question. What other biological processes might these ions be involved in? Things we haven't even considered yet.
It's definitely possible. Could they play a role in how our genes are expressed, for example? Or how our immune systems work? Or even in the aging process?
Those are some big questions. It seems like every answer just leads to even more questions and makes you realize just how much is still out there to be discovered.
That's the beauty of science. There's always more to learn, always more to understand.
This deep dive has really been an eye-opener. I never thought I'd be so fascinated by something as tiny as an ion.
Right. And it's not just about the science itself. This knowledge could have a huge impact on how we understand health and disease, maybe even life itself.
It's amazing to think that something so small can have such a big impact. So, what are some of the big unanswered questions that scientists are still trying to figure out when it comes to sodium and potassium?
Well, one area that's really interesting is the connection between these ion imbalances and disease. Like, we know that when things go wrong with sodium and potassium levels, it can cause problems like, an irregular heartbeat or muscle weakness.
Mm.
But could these imbalances also be involved in more complex things like Alzheimer's disease or autoimmune disorders or even cancer?
That's a fascinating thought. And if there is a connection there, could we potentially target those ion imbalances to create new treatments?
That's the hope. Scientists are exploring different ways to do that, like developing drugs that can restore ion balance in specific parts of the body, or even figuring out if things like diet and exercise can help regulate ion levels.
So even though this is all happening at a microscopic level, it has the potential to really make a difference in people's lives. It's pretty inspiring to think about the possibilities. But I also imagine that studying something this complex must come with its own set of challenges.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest challenges is just how complex biological systems are. It's not just about figuring out how sodium and potassium work on their own. It's about understanding how they interact with all these other molecules and processes that are happening in the cell at the same time.
It's like trying to put together a giant jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces look the same.
Right. And every time we make a new discovery, it seems like it opens up a whole new set of questions.
Okay.
But that's what keeps things interesting, right? That drive to unravel the mysteries of life, one tiny ion at a time.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of how these ions work to the really cutting-edge research that's pushing the boundaries of our understanding. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one last question for you.
Hit me with it.
What other biological processes might rely on these tiny but powerful ions? Could there be entire areas of biology that we haven't even considered yet where sodium and potassium are playing a crucial role?
Ooh, now that's a question to ponder. We've talked about nerves, muscles, fluid balance. But what about things like regulating our hormones or influencing our sleep cycles? Maybe they even play a role in how we perceive the world around us.
Wow, those are some thought-provoking ideas. It seems like every time we learn something new about these ions, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
Absolutely. That's what makes science so exciting. The journey of discovery never really ends.
It really is. The journey of discovery never really ends, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as sodium and potassium ions. We've been on quite a journey today exploring their world, haven't we?
We have, and it's amazing to think how these tiny elements have such a huge impact on how our bodies function.
Absolutely. From those nerve impulses that let us think and move to the muscles that power our every action. And let's not forget about those incredible channels that carefully control what goes in and out of our cells. It's all thanks to these little ions.
Tiny but mighty. And it seems like every time we learn something new about them, even more questions pop up.
Exactly. Speaking of learning new things, earlier you mentioned how the research in this field is constantly moving forward. What are some of the advancements on the horizon that have you really excited?
Well, for one thing, I think the future of indicators is incredibly promising.
Yeah.
Imagine indicators that are so sensitive, they can detect even the slightest, tiniest changes in ion concentration.
Wow, it would be like having a high-definition microscope, but for the world of ions.
Exactly. It would be revolutionary. We'd be able to see cellular activity in a whole new light, understand how things work at an even deeper level.
That's pretty mind-blowing. And what about biosensors? Any cool new developments on that front?
Oh, definitely. Scientists are working on creating biosensors that can be targeted to specific types of cells. So instead of just getting a general picture of what's happening, we could zoom in on specific cells and see how they react to different things.
So it's like having a tiny camera crew inside our bodies, broadcasting live from the cellular level.
That's a great way to put it. We could see how cells respond to changes in their environment, how they interact with each other, all in real time.
Amazing. But what about ionophores? I'm still really fascinated by the idea of using those to actually treat diseases. What does the future hold for that area of research?
Well, just imagine developing ionophores that are even more selective and precise than the ones we have today. We could target specific cells or tissues with incredible accuracy, correcting imbalances that might be contributing to a whole range of health problems.
So we could potentially manipulate cellular processes at a level of control we've never had before. That's incredible. But with all this cutting-edge science, I imagine there are still some pretty big challenges involved in studying something as tiny as an ion, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, biological systems are incredibly complex. We're not dealing with isolated parts here. Everything is interconnected, interacting in ways we don't fully understand yet. It's like trying to understand a symphony by listening to just one instrument.
I like that analogy. So how do scientists even begin to make sense of something that complex?
It takes a multi-pronged approach. They're using all sorts of advanced imaging techniques to observe these ions in action. And they're also using incredibly sophisticated computer models to simulate how these ions behave and interact within living systems.
We talked about computational modeling earlier, but could you explain a bit more about how that works and why it's so important in this field?
Sure, computational modeling allows scientists to essentially create virtual versions of biological systems. It's like having a digital laboratory where they can test out different scenarios and see how changes in one area might affect the whole system. They can run virtual experiments, manipulate ion concentrations, and observe the results, all without actually having to work with living cells or tissues.
So it's like a risk-free way to experiment and make predictions about how things might work in the real world.
Exactly. It's an incredibly powerful tool that's helping to accelerate research and deepen our understanding of these incredibly complex systems. But even with all these amazing advancements, we're still just beginning to unravel the mysteries of sodium and potassium ions. There's so much more to learn.
That's what makes it so exciting, though, right? There's always something new to discover.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today. From the basics of how sodium and potassium work, to the mind-blowing research that's pushing the boundaries of what we know about life itself.
It's been quite a journey, and I have to say I'm constantly in awe of the dedication and ingenuity of the researchers who are working tirelessly to unlock these secrets. Their work is truly inspiring.
It really is. And it just goes to show that sometimes the smallest things can have the biggest impact. So thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive today. It's been an absolute pleasure exploring this fascinating world with you.
The pleasure was all mine. And to everyone listening, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and never stop learning. The world of science is full of incredible discoveries waiting to be made.
And of course, a huge thank you to Assay Genie for providing the insightful article that sparked this entire conversation. We'll be sure to include a link in our show notes so you can delve even deeper into this fascinating topic. Until next time, stay curious and keep those ions flowing.